Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the American colonies. So let's go ahead and get started. So we had previously talked about Jamestown, but we're going to dig in more to that today. Notice on here you'll see that some things are white and some things are black. Whenever you are taking notes, make sure you write what's in black. Okay, so as kind of a review from the last set of notes, make sure that you do know that Jamestown is the first permanent English settlement. There were other attempts previously, like with Roanoke, but such with the Lost Colony, it was a failure. So now we're going to talk about the headright system. The headright system was a land grant program. This was designed to attract settlers because basically to survive economically, labor was essential. And so they needed people to come work the land once they had spread out. So where they got the name from, these different tracts of land were called headrights. And basically, this land was offered to settlers who would come and work the land. A typical headright was 50 acres, which sounds like a lot. And each laborer, they were brought across the Atlantic. And at the end, the person was given that land. But until that person was given the land, the actual, what was called master, that was the land that they were awarded until the person was freed of that contractual obligation. And actually, Virginia and Maryland operated under this system to begin with. So we talked about the starving times whenever Jamestown was almost another failure for the British, but they were saved by tobacco. We talked about John Rolfe being the first tobacco magnate. We talked about that in class, but I want to make sure you got it on here too. He was very wealthy because he actually was the person he was the first person to cultivate tobacco. He had gotten the seeds from the West Indies, and he actually was the first person to make tobacco profitable in the colonies. So it's pretty cool. We also talked about Bacon's Rebellion. Remember, this was that armed rebellion by Virginia settlers. It was named after Nathaniel Bacon. He was the leader. And the main thing, first of all, the rebellion was against Governor William Berkeley. And the grievances, the problems that they had was that the governor was stuck between a rock and a hard place. The governor seemed like he was dismissive towards the settlers whenever they wanted to spread west, but he was also dealing with natives wanting to keep them, or basically to appease them at that point. So he's trying to keep the peace. And so Nathaniel Bacon got together and they rebelled and basically set the town on fire and ran him out. And eventually the people who were with Bacon, they were tried and executed, and then Bacon actually died as well. Now, something that we had talked about in the last set of notes was how indentured servants eventually were phased out and replaced with African slaves, and the reasons why. Now, let's focus on the New England colonies here. So you have Plymouth and you have Massachusetts Bay. You have two sets of Puritans. Puritans themselves, they're English Protestants. Remember, you had the Protestant Reformation way back, where that was the major split off from the Catholic Church. But these people sought to purify the Church of England, the Puritans did, of different Roman Catholic practices. They maintained that the Church of England had not been fully reformed and needed to become more Protestant. So it became a larger movement. And so remember, these New England colonies, this is something we went over earlier in the unit. These New England colonies, they came over for religious freedom because they were persecuted overseas. Um, in Jamestown was founded for profit, essentially. Okay, the Mayflower Compact. So this does establish democracy in Plymouth. It was a set of rules for self-governance. And it was established by the English settlers who traveled to the New World on the Mayflower. So it's really unclear who actually wrote the Mayflower Compact. Excuse me. Um, but they usually give credit to William Brewster, but it's not really people are not really sure if he's actually the one. And people don't really know either what happened to the original copy of the Mayflower Compact, actually. But they do accept a translation from William Bradford's journal. William Bradford is the leader of Massachusetts Bay, and they eventually take over Plymouth. They kind of absorb them. So the basic rules that come out of the Mayflower Compact is that they are loyal subjects to King James, except in the way of their self-governance. They live in accordance with the Christian faith. They create one society and they work together to further that society and make it better. And they work for the good of the colony. So it remained active until 1691, whenever the Plymouth colony was absorbed by Massachusetts Bay. So, Massachusetts Bay itself, you actually have an assignment that's about Massachusetts Bay. There were 11 ships that carried Puritans over to Massachusetts Bay. One ship specifically was called the Arbella, and there's actually a speech, and it's called the City on a Hill speech. And it basically was saying that the Massachusetts Bay Colony was a shining example of what this new colony, what this new world is going to look like. They are a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. They're an example to the world. And this quote is something that's going to be used for a very long time. And other people will continue to reference it. And another thing that is interesting to think about is that they were running from religious persecution, but they did not allow freedom of religion, and there was no separation of church and state. And what's very interesting about Puritans, they believe in predestination. So this is the idea that God is an all-powerful and all-knowing being. Therefore, the fate of each individual, whether they go to heaven or not, is known to God at birth. And that nothing that someone can do can change that. And so if someone is truly saved, this is something else that they believe, they would only be capable of behavior endorsed by God. So it's very interesting how uptight some Puritans had to live their lives. And I will put this, oh, I'm sorry, I moved this, but underneath all of this, I will put that link down below. It's a piece of satire showing how Puritans lived their lives back then. They did not enjoy many fun things, to put it lightly. So some other New England colonies, you had Rhode Island, um, kind of, um, kind of the opposite, but not really. You had you had a Puritan dissenter, which is someone who had an opposing opinion within the Puritan faith, with Roger Williams, and so he founded the Providence Plantations, which became known eventually as Rhode Island. So he was a staunch advocate for religious freedom and separation of church and state. So in that way, yeah, they were the opposite of Massachusetts Bay. And so something else that's really cool about Roger Williams, he was one of the first abolitionists, people that believe that slavery should be ended. So he was one of the first abolitionists. Okay, so another leader within Rhode Island was Anne Hutchinson. So basically, she is a very, very interesting character. She was someone who early on challenged Puritan authority. She was born in England, and even her father was tried for heresy, not obeying by the church, or not obeying the church, excuse me, but charged for heresy by the Anglican Church or the Church of England. Because he had made comments and he was put in jail. So she had a background of kind of going against the grain. So, anyway, she was seen as someone who she came from, she came from a family that was well known, but she believed that heaven was attainable to anyone who worshiped God directly through a personal connection. And she actually would preach. She would preach that behavior and sin did not affect whether somebody went to heaven. And so this was a direct violation of Puritan doctrine. This was something that a lot of the male elders in the colony thought was just terrible. They thought that it was hurtful to the colony, hurtful to the faith. So they sent spies to her sermons and they ordered her to stop preaching, and then she didn't. So Anne had many, many children. So she was actually pregnant, and so they called her before the court in Massachusetts Bay. And she actually had someone who had been a friend of hers. He was a pastor who she actually followed over here, John Cotton. And he was on this court. And so she had to speak while she was pregnant at this trial and defend herself. But at the end, she lost her trial and was proclaimed a heretic. So her and her family and her supporters, they were banished from the colony, so they went to Rhode Island. That's where Rhode Island comes into play. So she unfortunately lost her baby. It had a condition that today is well understood, but not back then. And so, unfortunately, there were leaders from the Massachusetts Bay Colony who would say very mean things about her, saying that her baby was a result of her behavior and the things that she said, and that if she was actually a midwife before, and that people who had babies delivered by her were they were going to be, something wrong with them. So she was trying to escape all of the threats. And then eventually, her entire family was attacked by Native American warriors. And so she was actually axed to death. So John Winthrop had made comments about her after she had died and said that she was dealt with justly because she was an instrument of the devil. So Anne Hutchinson was someone who challenged the male-dominated religious authorities of the time. She was popular, but she threatened male leaders. She was the symbol of Christian feminism of the time. So very, very interesting individual there. So moving on to Connecticut, there was more religious freedom, but it is something that's kind of iffy. So in the early 1700s, they had adopted a Toleration Act, and it was based on the English Toleration Act. So it basically it introduced a measure of religious freedom that was lacking early on in the colony. However, if you were a dissenter, someone who had like a negative opinion, um, you had to register with the town clerk, and so your taxes still supported the Puritan church. So eventually, the Anglicans or the Church of England, they gained like a really strong foothold in Connecticut. So they became classified as dissenters. So anyway, now the main thing that I want you to understand about Connecticut is this is where we see the fundamental orders of Connecticut. So basically, um, this what it does is it first of all is seen as by a lot of people as the first written constitution in America. Period. Um, and it sets up the structure and power. And the order unfortunately gave more voting rights to men and made them eligible to run for elected positions. It sets up structure and power for the colony. And this is actually where Connecticut earned its name of the Constitution State. So, pretty cool. Okay, so native resistance in New England is something that at this point had not been new, but we're going to talk about the official end of it with King Philip's War. So, and we're talking about native resistance ending in New England, not the end of native resistance, because that is going to be around throughout most of this class that we're talking about. So the Pequot War it took place in New England, and it was between the Pequot tribe and an alliance of colonists that were from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and the Plymouth colonies, and another small colony called the Saybrook Colony. And so they also had allies from different tribes, one of them being the Mohegan tribe. So basically, they eliminated in the end the Pequot, who was an impediment to colonizing in southern New England. It was a really, really brutal war. Okay, so in the first 6 months of the war, the Pequot, they had, even with no firearms, they won every engagement against the British. So although those British muskets were superior, I know it's hard to think that a musket is superior to anything, but at this time it was. Muskets were superior to Pequot bows. Whenever you think about penetration and range, the Pequot were still able to use their knowledge of the terrain and their surroundings and all of this to their advantage. And so they used this strategy, and they were able to basically negate any advantage that the British had. So in the end, the war concluded, and the Pequot were essentially wiped out. About 700 of them had been killed or taken into captivity. And what this did demonstrate is that the British would be able to, and they would they would wage total war, which is waging war by all means necessary. So anyway, they did have some survivors of the Pequot tribe, but they would mesh in with other tribes, and they were given a reserved land status later on, so their descendants did have something later on. It wasn't much, and it's unfortunate, but they did have something. So moving on to King Philip's War. So basically, this was a series of battles in like southern New England again, between the Plymouth colonists and the Wampanoag Native Americans. So it was kind of the natives' last ditch effort to avoid recognizing British authority and to stop them from settling their lands. So the war is named after the Wampanoag chief Metacom. So he was known later on as Philip or King Philip. And this is actually him in the picture. So, anyway, he's the one who led this rebellion. So, after the Pequot War, um, the New England colonies, Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, and others, they realized they needed to form an alliance against their common enemies. So they formed the New England Confederation. And so them together, they fought the Wampanoag um, and other Native American tribes during this war. But the colonists did have some people or some natives on their side. So, before all of this had happened, Metacom, or King Philip, guy in the picture, his father had actually negotiated peace with Plymouth, but that wasn't really enough to stop the further encroachment on Native American lands. So basically, Plymouth was warned that Philip was about to attack. And he was warned actually by a guy named John Sassamon. John Sassamon, he was a Massachusetts man he was a native. He was a Christian convert, so they called him a praying Indian. And he served as kind of like an interpreter to the colonies. So anyway, he warned Plymouth that they were about to get attacked. And then some of the Plymouth colonies found him dead. So this kind of set off the chain of events. So in Plymouth, what they did was they put 3 Wampanoag men on trial for his murder, and they hanged them. They were convicted and they were hanged. And so whenever this happened, you start to see a series of attacks almost immediately. So it was a very brutal war, and the tide was turned immediately whenever the Mohawk Indians joined on the colonist side. So King Philip was actually shot, and then eventually he was hung, beheaded, drawn, and quartered. If you want to know what you should know what hung, beheaded, you should know what those are. But drawn and quartered, go look it up. It's terrible. And his head was actually placed on a spike and displayed at Plymouth for 2 decades. 2 decades. Anyway, that always grossed me out. Anyways, so basically, whenever he died, Philip Metacom, whenever he died, this kind of effectively ended the war. So with this, thousands of natives were killed, wounded, captured, sold into slavery, or became indentured servants. Ugh. So basically, this ends native resistance in New England. Okay, so Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn, and he was a Quaker. This was a place for Quakers to settle. So, as a Quaker, this was a religious group. So, they believed that people were inherently good. And this is the opposite attitude of the Puritans. William Penn's view of the government of Pennsylvania could be summed up in the words. I had to write this down because it always strikes a chord with me. Let men be good, and the government cannot be bad. It's so the opposite of Puritans. Anyway, something that the Puritans and the Quakers have in common is that the Quakers and the Puritans were mega dedicated to hard work. So the Quakers were a large group of early settlers, and they believed in a heavy tolerance of other people, and they tolerated other religious beliefs. So, in case you were wondering, the Quakers, they also were called the Religious Society of Friends. So They didn't really have a lot of elaborate religious ceremonies. They didn't have an official clergy, which is so different from Catholics and even other Protestant churches. And they also believed, and believe it or not, spiritual equality for men and women. This was way interesting for the time. They practiced pacifism, believed in peace, and they played a huge role from this point on in abolitionist movements and women's rights movements, which makes sense in their spiritual equality with women. And so, in case I meant to throw this in earlier, I'm sorry. Quaker was their name because it was a nickname, actually, because it said that it came from a biblical passage that people should tremble at the word of the Lord. So, since they were pacifists and since they were so very peaceful with everyone living around them, they had good native relations. So, anyways, we talked about New York towards the beginning of this unit. So it was taken from the Dutch by the British, and New York, from its inception, was a very booming, diverse city. Okay, so Maryland is very interesting. Maryland was a Catholic haven because Catholics, while they were sometimes persecuted in some areas. The Toleration Act is the main thing I want you to remember about Maryland. The act was meant to ensure freedom for religion, or excuse me, freedom of religion for Christian settlers of diverse persuasions in the colony. It didn't mean complete religious freedom. It was just kind of a pragmatic solution to this problem. Catholics had become a minority of the population, even though they were still really powerful, and they were in a lot of danger of being treated badly by the Protestant majority. So, this was a way of providing protection for Catholics, while at the same time kind of giving a nod to the British government, which was still firmly years after in control by the English Puritans. The last two colonies we're going to go over today, we have Carolina and then we have Georgia. So Carolina actually began, it was kind of a colony within a colony. In the mid 17th century, Barbados, the island of Barbados was the richest plantation colony. And they ran out of land, so they sought out the land in Carolina. So they moved a lot, unfortunately, of slaves to Carolina, and it made Carolina had a system of a hierarchy there. And it grew slowly until planters discovered the abundance of rice. It made them the most wealthy in English North America whenever they discovered rice, and it was the epicenter of mainland slavery, unfortunately. So Charleston, if you've ever been to Charleston, you know it's beautiful. It was a key port city, and it still is a big deal. So then for Georgia, Georgia is very interesting. Oh, by the way, I'm sorry. North and South Carolina, they don't split until 1712. I meant to mention that. I'm sorry. Georgia is very interesting. It was founded by James Oglethorpe, and the idea was to be a buffer to Spanish Florida, kind of to have that land in between the other colonies to keep the other colonies away from each other. So Oglethorpe had envisioned a colony which would serve kind of as a haven for British subjects who had been imprisoned for debt or what they called the worthy poor. Typically not people who were dangerous convicts, but what they did was they imposed like really, really strict laws that many colonists disagreed with, like banning alcoholic beverages. They were not okay with that one. But they there were a lot of people actually that did disagree with slavery down there on those smaller farms. Okay, and if you'll take a look at this map, you'll see obviously the rest up here. So that is it for today's notes. Have a good rest of your day.